All right, welcome everyone. We've turned on the recording. We're going to talk about chapter 15 and 16 of Crucifixion of the King of Glory. But before we do that, let's say a prayer as we always do, and then we'll get to our work. The nativity, O Christ, our God, has shone the light of wisdom upon the world, for thereby those who worship the star were taught by a star to adore thee, the Son of Righteousness, and to worship thee, the Orient from on high. O Lord, glory to thee. All right. First meeting after Nativity, and I hope everybody had a lovely feast.
Yes.
All right. So chapter 15 is not a real super long one, but boy, chapter 16 is. And that's why I thought it would be better for us not to try to take on 17 also, because that just was getting a bit too long. So we'll do 17 and 18 next month. So those who are watching this next week. So those who are watching this on the recording, please make note of that, that we will have chapters 17 and 18 next week. 18 is real short. So, okay. So when we look at chapter 15, right away we start to talk about the high priest mafia. Now, we've talked about this a little bit before. The idea that the Jewish aristocracy was, a bit out of control, and that was something that was very much a problem for the people. But here we focus especially on the high priest and the chief priests. And I think it's really instructive for those of us who serve as clergymen. People have a very high trust of us, and that can be abused. And we see here that it was quite abused. In our days, that's especially dangerous when the son of a priest becomes a priest in the same parish his father serves, and we can get this very mafia feeling about that. And even if there's no nepotism, we sort of have that assumption about that, and I think we have to be really careful. And that's why in our days this is usually avoided, not completely, but usually this is avoided. But nonetheless, because of the high amount of trust that are placed in clergymen, it's really important that we try to excel in avoiding anything that smacks of nepotism or anything that seems to be untoward. So before we go any further, I forgot to ask folks if there were specific things that they'd like to talk about before we go tonight. So we're just getting started, but does anyone have anything that they'd like to make sure that we talk about before we say good night? Going once, twice, 3 times. Okay, very good. So let's keep going then. So the high priesthood in Christ's time. I thought that was really interesting about the idea that someone who was a high priest, even if they were a high priest just for a day, that they are considered to be a kind of especially sanctified person for their entire life. And that word sanctified is very interesting, and I'm sure that was chosen carefully. Because the high priest corresponds to our bishop, right? Our bishop sort of serves that place in a way of the high priest liturgically. An interesting little piece of that is that the high priest's vestments had bells on them, and that's where our bishop's vestments got their bells, is from that particular practice. But the New Testament priests, bishops, deacons, they are indelibly marked, but it's not a question of sanctity. So like our clerical garb, what we wear is an outward expression of the interior reality that we are changed when we are ordained, that we are not the same person. We're not a completely different person, but we've been changed from a spiritual point of view, and that's why we wear a special kind of garb. And so there is an indelible mark, that's true. The idea of someone being unpriested or unbishoped is not in the East the same as it is in the West, because it's not a juridical question. It's not a legal question. When you're a priest, you're always a priest, even if for some reason you can't serve as a priest anymore. Even if you're quote unquote defrocked, you're still not the same person that you were. That isn't undone. We don't have an unordination, right? You're ordained. We don't go into the church and walk backwards around the altar to unordain someone. It's just silly. Whereas in the West, there's this kind of juridical concept that if you're defrocked, you're no longer a priest on any level, and we don't have that exact idea. It may be that someone cannot serve as a priest anymore, and they have been quote unquote defrocked, but nonetheless, they're still going to answer to God for the fact that they are a priest. And I think that that's something very interesting. So Christopher put a question in the chat. Interesting how the high priest could not go into Gentile courts, and if they did, they had to burn their clothes. I think when Jesus was in court, and some people could not go in. So yeah, that's very interesting. The high priest had some very specific rules around his life, the things that he could do and the things that he couldn't do. I found especially interesting that he had to be like set aside. There is this kind of, you know, like when somebody gets sick almost, he had to be set aside for 7 days before Yom Kippur so that he couldn't be ritually defiled in any way, because he had to go into the high holy of holies. So they'd kind of take him away and quarantine him, kind of, for lack of a better term. So I found that part very interesting also. So we do have the idea in the New Testament that when someone's a priest, when someone becomes a priest, that sort of changes them spiritually, but nonetheless, it's not a question of sanctity. Just because you fill that role doesn't mean that you're a sanctified person. So anyway, I thought that was very, very interesting. So the high priesthood, according to the Old Testament law, is supposed to be hereditary, and priests served for life. But this had changed completely by Christ's time. It's just one of the many things that had changed, and that when Christ came, well, he was trying to set straight some of these many changes that the Jews had made to the Old Testament law. I also find it very interesting, I don't know about you, the idea about the city of refuge, and that if someone committed a serious crime but by mistake, like he killed someone by mistake, let's say you ran over somebody with your ox cart. Okay, you didn't do it on purpose, it just happened. A person could avoid the punishment for that by fleeing to one of the cities of refuge. They're listed in the Old Testament. But then on the death of a high priest, they could go back to their homes, because the death of that priest was thought to have a propitiatory effect. Like it sort of made it possible for those sins to be cleansed away, and a person to go back to where they lived. They didn't have to be exiled anymore. I found that pretty interesting too, even if the person was not serving as a high priest when he died. So anyway, those points I thought were interesting. I don't know if anyone has other thoughts about that. Christopher put something in the chat. Does anybody else have thoughts about that? Like verbal bookkeeping, yeah. Exactly. Any other thoughts about this piece? Okay, then we get to something which I think is becoming a theme here in our reading, which is this arrangement between Rome and the Jewish aristocracy. This is another kind of sticky issue for us in the New Testament. That is the relationship with government authorities for the clergy. And we have a very interesting approach in America to that. And I say interesting because it's novel. You don't find this idea of the separation of church and state in the old world. It just doesn't exist. There are state churches. Everybody has a state church, essentially, unless they pretend to be a communist country or something like that. But every country has a state church. France has a state church. Spain, everybody. And so that is a completely different relationship than what we have here in America. And the idea in America that the founding fathers had has been completely bastardized, because their idea was to protect the church from the state. And now it's become that the state is, so that the church is supposed to stay away from the state. That was never the point. The point was the state was supposed to not persecute the church. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense, because the pilgrims were religious refugees, right? They came seeking refuge from a state church. So the founders were real interested in keeping the state from having anything to do with the church, but they weren't interested in keeping the church out of public affairs. If you read the Federalist Papers, which everybody should do, you get an idea of the way America was founded, and it was not to keep the state out of the church out of commenting on state affairs. It was to keep the state from persecuting the church. So anyway, I thought that was very interesting, and that was a problem in the Old Testament times. Now, she puts a footnote in there that says that essentially for Jewish people in the first century of Palestine, there was no difference between politics and religion. Those two things were synonymous. And we've talked before about how this was a theocracy, right? There's different kinds of governments, but a government which is run by clerics essentially is a theocracy. The one that we know of in our times that's the most sort of well known is the in Iran. In the what are they? I can't remember what the official name of the country is anymore. But anyway, that's a theocracy. The clerics run the country. It's not a democracy. It's not really a dictatorship. It could be a dictatorship theocracy, I suppose. But essentially, it's rule of clerics. And that's what it was in first century Palestine. Now, of course, the Romans really ruled, but the Romans were just really interested in keeping people paying taxes and being quiet. They at that time were not all too concerned that the Jews were not the best kind of the best Romans. Like as they considered them to be slaves in any case, and there wasn't a time when they were making people pay homage to the empire by making to the emperor by making sacrifices, right? So there wasn't a patriotism test. That came later, about the turn of the first century. That's when the persecutions began very strongly against Christians and Jews too, because the Jews also wouldn't, of course, wouldn't burn incense at a statue of the Roman Empire emperor. Sorry, but this was not the case at this time. They weren't demanding that. There wasn't really this emperor worship, which came up about the year 91 probably, is when it really came to that part of the world. There had been from time to time in Rome, there had been a little bit of emperor worship, but very little, actually, very, very little. And this was something that we sort of think as part and parcel of Roman life, but it wasn't. But it did become a thing at about the turn of the first century, and that's when the first great persecutions of the Romans took place, where the Romans were persecuting the church. Before that, it was mostly, strictly speaking, it was the Jews who were not very happy with Christianity, and so they were doing the persecuting. But the Romans jumped in around the turn of the first century, and the Jews got in their sights too, because they also would not make sacrifices to the emperor as a god. Okay, so this political arrangement between Rome and the Jewish aristocracy, it has all kinds of negative effects, and it also and we'll talk about those as we go forward. But this is something that we also have to be very careful about in our lives as Christians. How exactly do we have that interaction, and to make sure that it doesn't become this point where the government is influencing the church. So the wealth of the high priestly families, that was, in our eyes, this would be clearly excessive, right? I mean, and it was for the average Jewish person too. They had all of this wealth. You know, the priests' wives had a special, allowance for buying jewels and perfumes and so on and so forth. And I know they still do that at Dormition Cathedral down in Ferndale. We've gotten rid of that a long time ago. So, of course, I'm joking, Marlene. I don't think you have a special fund for the jewels of the priests' wives. It's just so goofy. Of course, we would never do anything like that. And it led to revolts by the people. All of this excess led to revolts by the people. And in fact, it led to the revolt that eventually destroyed the Second Temple. That took place, and that was the people revolting against the excesses of their leaders. So I'm sorry, Marlene, did you want to say something?
No, I froze up, so I couldn't respond to your comment there, but I wanted you to see that I was smiling, that's all.
Okay, very good. So that's interesting. We talked about this once before. This is kind of like the prosperity gospel. People like Joel Osteen are preaching that, if you're rich, it means that God is blessing you. Actually, we would probably argue from an Orthodox point of view, it's the opposite. That this is something, the more wealth we have, the more we have to answer to the Lord. It's not that we're seeking poverty necessarily, but we're also not seeking excessive wealth. But this was seen as a sign of the prosperity and good that they were doing. Yeah, Christopher, that's a good point about they had to follow rules, quote unquote, but they knew that they were treating Jesus inappropriately. And we're going to get to that here pretty soon. So anyway, what's interesting, I think, and I want to just make a note of this, the standard in the Orthodox Church is that a priest should receive essentially the average income of his parishioners. And I think a good anecdote about that, Father Andrei Popkov told me this one time. His great-grandfather was a priest in the village. And so, just like everybody else, he had a piece of land that he worked. That was the average thing that everybody did there. And he was given a piece of land to, and he worked that, and that's how his family survived. But then his grandfather was a priest in Moscow, and it was completely different. He had a completely different life. He didn't work any land. He received actually a really high salary. And so the difference in just one generation, but it's because that was what the average of the people in his parish. So that makes perfect sense. So anyway, that's always been the Orthodox way, and I think that's really good for us to understand. Obviously, that wasn't the way there. We see that there was a huge dichotomy between the high priests and the chief priests kind of in one place, and then the common priests in another place. And she, for the not the first time, mentions in this chapter about how they used to like steal things from the high priests and chief priests would steal things from the common priests to the point where sometimes the common priests and their families would starve. So it was a really imbalanced situation there. And there was a lot of bribery. There was a lot of nepotism. And, of course, it's completely forbidden in the Orthodox Church to have bribery on any level. And simony was rampant also. That's like paying for your clerical position. Like paying for ordination, like that completely banned in the church, completely and absolutely. But that was rampant there. Of course, that was no good for them either. But that apparently was happening all the time. And the Romans controlled the appointment of the high priest. As I mentioned, that was supposed to be a hereditary position, and it was supposed to be for life. It wasn't supposed to just be for a year. And they used that so that they could receive bribery every year from the high priest as they appointed him. So the rabbis, remember, were not priests. The rabbis were the teachers in the synagogues. There's just one temple where the priesthood was exercised. That was the temple. Everything else in the whole world was a synagogue. There were no sacrifices in the synagogues. They were places where people went and they listened to the scripture and they were taught by the rabbis. Well, the rabbis had been pointing out for some time the corruption of the high priest and the chief priest. So there was kind of like this, at least a disagreement. I don't want to say a war, but a disagreement between the rabbis and the priests about the corruption of the high priests. So Christopher popped something in there. I didn't read it. Let's see. It took way too long for things to change back then. Yeah, it really did take a long time. And because there was no other power except the Romans, and the Romans just didn't care. They were happy. They didn't care if the high priests were corrupt or not. In fact, they kind of liked it because then they had some control over the situation. So in the end of this chapter, we touch on the interrogation of Jesus by Annas, who had been the high priest. He was the father-in-law of Caiaphas. So I think the important point here that I'd really like to make is that, and she stresses it too, Jesus had said nothing secretly. He had taught nothing secretly. There are no secret teachings in Christianity. Everything is completely open. If you want to read the prayers that the priest reads during the service, you can read those prayers. That's fine. It says in the prayer book that these are, sometimes it's mistranslated as secret prayers. It's not secret prayers. They're quiet prayers. It's just a bad translation of the Slavonic. But anybody can read those. Right? I mean, there's no secrets in Christianity, but where there are secrets is in the occult, and there are secrets in the Gnostic sects, which were the first real heresy of Christianity, were the Gnostics. So that secret concept, that's what the occult uses, that's what the Gnostics use, but we don't have that in Orthodox Christianity at all. So Jesus resisted Annas's questions because the process of interrogating him in this way without witnesses first confirming Jesus's guilt, that was illegal. And he understood that very well because he gave the law. So he knew exactly how it was supposed to work. So he resisted that part of the persecution. Now, he was struck by a temple guard during that interrogation by Annas, and I think we should just mention who they are. These are the ones also who arrested Jesus, right? It's pretty clear that wasn't a Roman group of people who arrested him, especially when he named the name of God and they all fell down on their faces. It's obvious that they were Jews. So this is the temple guard, and they were in charge of security at the temple. We've heard about them a couple of times in our reading, and they were also kind of like the personal security for the high priest and the chief priests. So apparently, insulting the high priest was also considered the same as insulting God himself, and the guard thought that Christ had insulted the high priest, and so he struck him. The captain of the temple was the leader of the temple guards, and he was the second priest in command in the temple, and usually he became the high priest after the present high priest. So it was kind of like, we would think, I guess, kind of like the vice president, right? So second in command, and when if the high priest couldn't do it, couldn't go on, or couldn't pay the bribe to the Romans, then the captain of the temple would be the one that would take over, most likely. Okay, so that's chapter 15. Those are some highlights as I saw it. I'll send out the study guide, of course, as usual. Anybody else have thoughts about chapter 15? Okay, now let's go on to 16. 16 is a big one. They're very long. Good, I think, really interesting. A ton of information. She's not, in my opinion, excessively wordy as an author. Like, she gets to the point for the most part and tells you what's going on. So we begin chapter 16 with this secret trial at Caiaphas's house. Okay, so he was the high priest, and the biggest danger for the Jewish aristocracy to the status quo where they were flourishing was if there was a revolt against the Romans. This was the thing that was most likely to endanger their status quo, which, when they were getting very rich and had a lot of power and a lot of prerogatives, they had a lot of privileges, and the only real danger to that status quo that they could see was a revolt by the people against the Romans. The people felt that Jesus was the Messiah. And so the aristocracy felt that they had to undermine that view so that people would not revolt, and also that they would not kill him in such a way that the people would revolt. It was a kind of a tight situation for them, because probably many of them thought that he was the Messiah too, but he wasn't the Messiah that they wanted. In any case, the danger was at Passover. Remember, this was all around Passover. At Passover, the Jews celebrate the deliverance from Egypt, from slavery into freedom, right? So the patriotism in the Jewish people would be especially high at this time, and that's what the high priest and the chief priests were really scared about. That's what the Sanhedrin was scared about, is that people would be at a very high patriotic level, very excited to celebrate the holiday, this freedom of the Jewish people from the enslavement by the Egyptians, and that they would see Jesus Christ as the Messiah, which they mostly did, and they would decide that, okay, this Messiah has come to help us throw off the Romans, let's revolt, and he'll take care of it for us. So this was a big danger for them, and everything has to be understood in that context. Okay, so they had to kill Christ, they had to un-Messiah him, quote unquote, in such a way that the people would not revolt. So they were in a tight spot. But their secret meeting with Christ there at Caiaphas's house, this trial, this violated Jewish law on several accounts. First of all, trials could only be held in the daytime. That was part of the law. You couldn't have a trial at night. You couldn't have a trial on the eve of a Sabbath or on the eve of a holiday, of a great holiday. And this was both. Passover and the Sabbath were going to align here. So this was a really big holiday, and they were violating that, not having a trial on the eve of something big, doubly in this case. And then also, I found very interesting this law that you can't pronounce a guilty verdict on someone until you've slept on it. That I thought was that's a very interesting thing, because we often hear about this in the church that, okay, there is this problem. This problem needs to be solved. But a lot of times, especially when you talk to the bishops, they'll say, okay, let's sleep on it and see what it looks like tomorrow. And it's so interesting to see the different perspectives in that regard, and how it can really give you a different view of things. But it's interesting that it was codified in Jewish law that you could not give a guilty verdict on the day of a trial. You could pronounce someone innocent, but not guilty on the day of a trial. So in all these ways, they violated their own law as they were judging Christ. Interesting, I thought that the Great Sanhedrin had the exclusive right to try only three kinds of people: a high priest, a king, and a false prophet. So the irony of that trial was that they were trying Jesus Christ as a false prophet, but the reality is that he was the great high priest and he was the great king. So there's a lot of irony, and she points it out in this chapter. There's a lot of irony in the New Testament. There's a lot of irony in the scriptures. It's a kind of easy to understand rhetorical device, and God seems to like that because he uses it a lot. Well, whether he likes it or not, I don't know, but he uses it a lot. And so that's something that it's good for us to keep an eye out for. Irony, hypocrisy is a kind of irony. Like, there's a lot of irony, and we see that here. So witnesses were needed to convict someone, and this was a big problem for them because two witnesses had to agree on all the details surrounding something. Now, this was a law which was put in place to prevent false testimony. Now, it makes sense. If people are making up a story, it's very hard to make up a story which aligns. Not hard to talk about something that's the truth. If something was true and two people saw it, they're mostly going to agree on that. But if we're talking about a lie, if we're talking about perjury, it's pretty hard for people to have their story straight. And they had a lot of trouble with that in this trial that they were conducting there at Caiaphas's house. They had a lot of trouble getting people to agree, to find two witnesses that agrees. It says there was a lot of witnesses, but they couldn't agree. And then finally they got two witnesses to agree. But they agreed on something that actually Christ never said, right? He didn't say, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. He said something similar to that, but he didn't say that. And I think that's she points that out very well. He said to the scribes and the Pharisees, if you destroy this temple in 3 days, I will raise it up. And this temple, it meant his body. He's talking about the resurrection. He wasn't talking about the temple that was found in Jerusalem. So anyway, that as with many things that are false, they're not usually wildly false. They're just a step or two away from the truth, and that's the case here as well. Okay, then we do a little dive into Caiaphas and who he is and what he means. So I thought that was interesting that the Romans kept the high priestly garments. I didn't know that they kept the high priestly garments in their fort. And this is a way that they exerted control over the high priest because he had to wear his vestments to do his duties, right? And so they kept it there. And I'm sure they had to receive a big bribe to give those every time and so on and so forth. And so they had they used that to keep control over the situation there. They weren't stupid. They understood the reality that was on the ground there. And I also found it interesting that Caiaphas was able to stay high priest for 18 years. That's a lot of politics in this situation, and probably a lot of bribery as well. Also, when they got the vestments from the high priest, from the Romans, they had to bless them every time because they had been defiled by being in a place where there were people worshiping idols. So very interesting. I thought I did not know that. It was only for a short time. Just happened to be around the time of Christ. It hadn't happened before, and it didn't happen. And they gave them back afterwards. But anyway, during this time, the Romans did keep hold of those. So all of this questioning of Christ by the Sanhedrin, the witnesses were not enough for a death penalty, right? There was no death penalty in the Old Testament for the destroying the temple, which is kind of interesting. I mean, it seems kind of blasphemous, but in any case, that was not blasphemous enough in any case. So they kept pushing him and trying to get him to say something and so on and so forth. And Christ was silent. And she quotes from Isaiah, which I think is really interesting, and I'm going to read that to you right now. If I can quickly find that. I put it on the wrong page. I must have. Hold on, we'll find that. 140. As I looked right at it.
I have it here if you want, Heather.
Oh yeah, you want? Where is it? What
It's
page?
well, I'm on Kindle, so it's not going to coincide with.
Okay. Why
It's
don't you read it about the
prophecy.
lamb being
like a
about
lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth.
Yeah, there it is. It's on 147 for people who are looking in the book. So I wanted to call your attention to that because that's one of the prayers that we say as we cut the lamb that will become the body of Christ at the Divine Liturgy. So I just thought you would be interested to know that there are the prayers that are read are from that 53rd chapter of Isaiah as we're cutting the lamb and preparing it at the proskymedia that happens. This is the part that happens before the Divine Liturgy, where the gifts are prepared. The wine and the water are put into the chalice. The lamb is cut. The prosper is cut into a kind of a cubical piece, which we call the lamb, and that's what becomes the body of Christ. So anyway, that particular prayer is read then, and I thought that people would find that interesting. They also talk about the Messiah and a new temple, that this was part of some of the prophecies about the Messiah, and this is from Zechariah. So let me read that quickly for you. A prophecy of Zechariah foretold that the Messiah would build a new temple. Thus says the Lord of hosts, behold, the man whose name is the branch, for he shall grow up in his place, and he shall build the temple of the Lord. So I thought this was interesting about the branch too. So we often hear this concept of the root of Jesse, right? So Jesse is the father of David, right? So the root of Jesse. So this is why the Messiah has to come from David's line, right? So we're thinking and singing and praying about this the whole time in the Nativity of the Lord. But this idea of a branch that's coming from the root of Jesse, that is from David's line. So that's kind of, I think, very interesting as well. And then there were 5 reasons she listed that the aristocracy saw Christ as a danger to the status quo. The first was when he cleansed the temple. Remember, he made a whip, and he drove out the money changers and the dove sellers and so on and so forth. So that ruined their business. So that was the first thing. We talked about that several chapters ago. Then the second was this inaccurate accusation that he had threatened to destroy the temple. Okay, he had never done that, but that's what the witnesses said. His entry into Jerusalem on a donkey. Okay, that's an obvious fulfillment of Zechariah chapter 9. And the crowd welcoming him by shouting the messianic titles of Son of David and King of Israel. This is the entry of the Lord into Jerusalem that we often also call Palm Sunday, right? And finally, the fact that the people overwhelmingly considered Jesus to be the Messiah, or at least a prophet, because of his astonishing powers. So those were the things that the Jewish authorities felt were endangering the status quo, were endangering them. And this is why they felt that they needed to kill Jesus. Okay. That's what in. Yeah, there we go. Good. So that's, I think, a good point, and that's on page 149 if you want to review those. I know that everyone read this, and some people even memorized it. Okay. So I thought was super interesting. Maybe I'm just ignorant, but this idea where Caiaphas compels Jesus to speak, right? I adjure thee by the living God. And probably we all remember that little phrase because we hear it at the 12 Gospels every single year, I adjure thee by the living God that you say whether you're the Christ, the Son of God. And apparently, according to their practice, that essentially put Christ under oath, or would put anyone under oath, and they would have to answer. And if they didn't answer, then they were essentially admitting that what they had been accused of was true. And this is so foreign for at least for an American and probably for a Westerner, this idea that you could be compelled to testify against yourself, that somebody could make you say something that was bad for you. So we obviously don't have that, but they did then. And so I may try this sometime. We'll see. But in any case, I doubt it'll work. But it's very interesting that that was the case. So it's ironic that Peter was praised for noting that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. But now the aristocracy was using the same claim to kill Christ, the exact same thing that Peter was praised for. Yeah, so I thought that was pretty interesting. Let's pause and see if folks have any questions or comments before I just go barreling forward. Okay, so she does a little side trip here about revolutionaries and messiahs, which in modern biblical scholarship are essentially treated the same. But she makes a pretty big argument, and I think a good one, that there's only was one person who claimed to be the Messiah in any serious way that anybody took seriously in the entire Second Temple period. That's after the Babylonians had destroyed the temple and the Jews had come back and rebuilt it. That's a long time. Only one real serious Messiah, and that was Jesus Christ. There were a lot of revolutionaries, people who wanted to fight against the Romans, people who wanted to fight against the Jewish aristocracy, so on and so forth. But there was only one real serious Messiah, and that was Jesus Christ. So, but it's interesting that modern scholarship kind of puts them together, and I think that's because they don't see Christ as God, right? They don't see Jesus Christ as God, so they just lump him in as some kind of revolutionary. But he didn't have an army. Well, he had an army of angels, but he didn't have an army, and he wasn't trying to do a violent revolution. So anyway, I think, but he was definitely revolutionary, definitely radical, not in a positive way, trying to radically change the bad things that had crept in to human nature. Well, maybe not human nature, but human practice, and especially the practice of the Jews at that time. So he's claiming to be the Son of God, not a Son of God, because there's this, she points out that Son of God is kind of a way that people would say in those days, like a third person way to say I. But he's pointing out here that he's the one and only Son of God. So there's a big difference there. And I thought that was interesting. Most Jews did not expect the Messiah to be God. They thought he'd be a leader, likely to throw off the Romans, lead the Hebrews to conquer the world, but not that he would be God. Although there are definitely some prophecies that point out that he should be God. Nonetheless, that was not the common expectation of people in the first century, that the Messiah would be God. It was an expectation that the Messiah would come, but they thought he would be more of a liberator. And then we talk a little bit about how he uses that turn of phrase, "You have said so." So this is an interesting way for Christ to confirm the truth of what someone is saying. And he especially used that in a powerful way with Judas, to whom he said this, Caiaphas, to whom he said this, and Pilate, to whom he said this. The three people who were most responsible for his death, they confirmed exactly who Jesus Christ was in their own words as they were accusing him. And in all these cases, instead of just saying, yes, he said, "You have said so." That allowed them to testify to the truth. And of course, the truth is not a concept for us as Orthodox Christians. The truth is a person, and that's Jesus Christ. Chrysostom says that he confirmed his divinity to take away all the leaders' excuses. They knew exactly who he was. They said who he was, and later they couldn't deny that, even at their own judgment in front of him as God. So I think it's very interesting that at least for me, I found that little piece, like page 152, 153, very, very interesting. And if you didn't get a chance to read that, I would go back and do that, because I think it's pretty cool. Now here we talk about the vision of Daniel. We know that the last book of the Bible is an apocalypse. It's called the apocalypse, but it's not the only apocalypse in the Bible. That's a kind of literature. It's a kind of mystical literature. And the book of Daniel is another one of those. You could probably argue that Ezekiel is too. There's not a ton, but there's more than just the apocalypse. Anyway, in Daniel, there's a lot of visions. And one of the visions is when he sees the Ancient of Days. So I thought this was a pretty cool quote. And let's see if I can find it this time. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So here, when Christ is describing himself as the Son of Man, he's describing himself as that from that book of Daniel. And everybody understood that. All the Jews understood that was the Son of God. And so this, I think, was a very important point. This was who was going to sit at the right hand of the Father. That was not just some common person. That was going to be God. And this is how Christ was using that turn of phrase, Son of Man. He knew it, and the Sanhedrin knew it as well. So I think that's a very important piece for us to be attentive to. And Christopher put something in there. Yeah, he's right. You're right. Pontius Pilate's wife had a vision. Remember, she told him to have nothing to do with this just man. So you're absolutely right there. Okay, so we get to the point where they have decided that he has, because he's called himself the Son of Man, and said to Caiaphas, as you said it, or you have said it, that he was God and the Messiah. Caiaphas decided that he has uttered blasphemy, and blasphemy is something that, as she said, every good Jew of that time would feel that they needed to kill a person who did such a thing. They then beat Christ severely. We often forget that part. We remember that the Romans made him a crown of thorns and so on and so forth, but he was beaten here by the Jewish aristocracy. So I think that's good for us to not forget. And she points out that the irony of the Jewish trial is that Jesus is condemned to death precisely for who he truly is, the Messiah and the Son of God. So those were the things that I read that I thought were interesting. And if anyone would like to discuss any of those or anything that you found that was interesting, I'd be very happy to talk about that now.
Okay, I have a question really quick.
Well, Christopher.
Okay, so it goes back to that question about Pontius Pilate's wife having a vision. So
Yes.
So how long, like, did Pontius Pilate like go home like every night for a few nights and like talk to his wife like, hey man, this man Jesus is like really not guilty, but they're trying to have me kill him. So did she have any kind of like foreknowledge? Because I guess Pontius Pilate didn't really know about him until he showed up.
Yep. No,
But like how did his wife have the vision? Did he go home one night and kind of like debrief her a little bit, and then she had the vision after she kind of heard what was going on? Was Pontius Pilate at work, or like?
Nope, it wasn't like that. She had no context and no reason to be able to kind of identify Christ. That all happened in a very short period of time, so he didn't have time to go talk to her. So the fact that she sent word to him and said, "Have nothing to do with this man, this just man, because of what I've suffered in a dream today for him," that was something completely miraculous and kind of like a get out of jail free card for him. He decided not to take it, but yeah, he hadn't told her about him, so she didn't have the opportunity to kind of imagine something based on what he said. That was out of the blue, so to speak.
But wasn't she kind of already follower, or she became Christian after he?
I think it was after. I believe it was after. I'll have to read that again, but I'm 99% sure it was after.
Mhm.
Yeah, good questions. Other questions or thoughts?
I have in the back of my mind for the last few weeks, I've been wanting to ask this question. We read in the scripture that Christ came in the fullness of time or at the right time. I'm not sure exactly what the right words are. With all this going on with the leadership and all the corruption and the bribery, I'm wondering if that an indicator of the right time.
Oh, I would think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's those things are not unconnected. I think the church is pretty clear about that. Yes.
Okay.
Good. And Marlene, I saw that you had your hand up too.
Yeah, the other point that I don't think you touched on, but that was very interesting to me is that when Caiaphas proclaimed blasphemy, he tore his garments, and that was actually something very forbidden by the high priest. But
Yeah,
was
wasn't that
his way of
interesting?
saying what a horrible offense it was.
Exactly. The high priest, strictly speaking, was not allowed to tear his garments or to wear torn garments. So Chrysostom said that St. John Chrysostom is sort of assumes that he did that for like purposes of the drama to get the rest of the Sanhedrin to pay attention, because that was something so unheard of that the high priest would do that. And that when he did that, that must have made a huge impact on everyone who was there. So yeah, I found that very interesting too. Let's see. Yeah, Christopher. So the book says that there was just a few families, 4 families were in charge of the high priesthood. Yeah, it became a very insular thing. Like it was a mafia. I have no problem calling it that. I think that's a perfect explanation of what was going on. Is it was essentially a mafia. And it was, it's not that they were just, like taking care of religious things either. Like they had all these side places where they were making big money. They were extraordinarily wealthy. And it's kind of ironic that they killed Christ to keep their positions. But because they just kept abusing the people, eventually they revolted. And that's why the Romans destroyed everything. That's why they destroyed the temple. It was because of the revolt, which came from the abuse that the people received, and from the high priests and the chief priests, and the really huge dichotomy of wealth. So they killed Christ to keep their positions, but they kept going down the same road, and that eventually cost them everything. Good. Very interesting discussion. Anyone else have thoughts that they'd like to share about this or anything else? If you have other questions about the book or the price of tea in China, which I don't know, but I did receive some tea from Singapore. That was cool for Christmas.
Yeah.
Our diocesan pastoral school works with the Southeast Asian Exarchate, which you might not even know exists, but we have a metropolitan. We have 2 metropolitans, an archbishop, and a bishop in Southeast Asia in the Russian Orthodox Church, because there's so much growth there of Orthodox Christianity, especially in Philippines and Thailand. Those are booming. But we have somebody in Vietnam now because things are just going crazy, and Korea actually. So anyway, the bishop there, he's a vicar. He's not a ruling bishop. He's helping one of the metropolitans. He's in charge of educating the clergy. So we've been working together for years on that. Well, it just turns out that one of his spiritual children is now a student at University of Michigan. And so he sent through her a box of tea for me from there. So I'm looking forward to that. I bet it's going to be a little different than the powdery stuff that we drink here in America. My guess is it's going to be leaves and very good. So anyway, that was a nice surprise.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we will not prolong our time together. Everyone needs to get to keep celebrating the Nativity of Christ, and I'm sure that people want to get back to that. So thanks everybody for your time tonight, and let's pray, and then we'll say good night and look forward to seeing each other next Wednesday. where again we will do that long 17th chapter and the short 18th chapter, which comes after, which is like 2 pages, and then we'll be right back on our schedule. It is truly meet to bless thee, the Theotokos, ever blessed and most blameless, and mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, and beyond compare more glorious than the seraphim, who without corruption gave us birth to God, the Word, the very Theotokos, thee do Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank
That's
you. Good
right.
night.
Good night.